Welcome back, everybody, to our second screencast on the 1920s. So today we're really going to focus on culture of the 1920s, and really you can kind of see a lot of parallels between 1920s culture and a lot of modern-day American culture. And really, I mean, a lot of people I think look back to this era as the birthplace of a lot of modern American ideas, as far as consumerism, um, you know, such an emphasis on entertainment and leisure time and having fun, and kind of a new sense of morality that really wasn't a part of American culture prior to the 1920s. It is in a small way, but it's really going to kind of grow during this era. So you're going to see a lot of new innovations technologically, but a lot of new innovations as far as culturally too in the 1920s. So the first thing that I want you to kind of be aware of and to know is something called consumer culture. Another word you might hear is consumerism. And this is really going to kind of grow during the 1920s in a monumental way. So during World War I, you had a lot of this propaganda that's being used to try and get people to support the war effort. And really what propaganda is one-sided advertisements. And they had advertisements prior to World War I also, but not in the same way as after World War I. It's really going to kind of take off and kind of almost get a life of its own here after World War I. And so consumer culture and consumerism is kind of trying to get people to buy products for the sake of buying products, really. And it's trying to convince them that they need to buy these products for whatever the reason may be. And so you're going to see great technological innovations here during the 1920s, like the radio and the phonograph are going to become very popular, the mass production of the automobile, the washing machine, all these different really technological innovations. And so what advertising companies are going to try and do is try and create a demand for these products and try and get people to not only want to buy them, but feel like they have to buy them. And so the American economy in a lot of ways is going to start to grow, but a lot of the growth is going to be consumer-based, consumer products. They're not essential products. And so these consumer-based products are really what's going to kind of fuel some of the growth of the American economy at the time. And a lot of it has to do with this increase in advertisement targeted specifically towards consumer products. And so a lot of this stuff, I put these ads up that I thought you guys might find them kind of funny, actually, because if you look at modern-day America, it's the complete opposite of what they thought in the 1920s. This woman right here in this ad, they're trying to gain weight. And I mean, when's the last time you saw something like that in an American ad? And again, for this kid, he's trying to gain weight also. He wants to be husky and well-built. And you never really see ads like this now. And so you kind of see the difference. All this is advertisement, trying to sway people's minds to think a certain way, to buy a certain way, whether it's to be skinny or to gain weight or, to be tall, whatever it is, to jump higher with shoes. And all of this is kind of a product of advertisement. So you see the birthplace of a lot of things that you kind of take for granted as a part of your society in the 1920s as far as advertisement and consumerism and trying to get people to buy products. So I just wanted to put up some other ones, some famous companies like Coca-Cola and Wrigley's are out there trying to promote their products at the time. Now, with all of this consumerism and trying to get people to buy products, a lot of American families do not have the money to buy these products. And so what they're going to start to do in the 1920s, and they had done this previously, but it's really going to, again, take off in the 1920s, is using credit to buy products. So I just want to look at your textbook for a second because they have pretty good numbers here. 80% they said of radios were bought on credit, 75% of washing machines, and 85% of furniture were all bought on credit during the 1920s. So you're talking about an exorbitant amount of using credit to buy your products here. So the consumerism is pushing these products to buy these new innovative products, and people want them, but maybe they can't really afford them, so they're buying them through the use of credit. And you can see that in American culture now. I mean, think about how many people are on credit card debt and have these problems and are buying products that they really can't afford, these big ticket items that they can't afford. And so they're putting them on credit to try and pay them off. And you see kind of this start to grow in the 1920s. And you could see some of the problems that might be associated with an economy that's starting to be increasingly consumer-driven, and credit is playing a major role. There are major flaws in this 1920s economy. All right, so like hand in hand with the consumerism and the advertisement is you're going to have a growth of leisure and entertainment. So this again is something new to American society. To a small extent, you had leisure and entertainment for a long time in American society, but it's really going to expand during this time period again. So really one of the big inventions that's going to help it to expand is going to be the radio. So the radio is a pretty brand new form of entertainment. Now, we don't really necessarily look at the radio as entertainment, but it definitely was entertainment. If you're looking at the picture here, it would be like a big set in your living room, and people, instead of sitting around the television or their computer at night, would sit around the radio and listen to radio programs. And radio programs the radio is not used the way that it is today. So in today's world, the radio is for music, and sometimes you have some talk radio, but you had radio programs just like we would have TV shows, and you would kind of tune into these radio programs. They would broadcast baseball games, boxing matches, and so it kind of led to an expansion of entertainment in the United States that could reach everybody. And so in a lot of ways, this is going to kind of create more of an American culture than previously. In a lot of previous sections that we've talked about sectionalism in the United States and the Southern culture, the Northern culture, and the Western culture. The radio is the first kind of mass communication that really reaches everybody. And so you have all different types of Americans kind of listen to this and be entertained. And so entertainment kind of takes off in the 1920s because in a lot of ways, some people are doing better than they have before, and they have more leisure time. And so they're going to have time to pursue more leisure activities or to watch things and do things that they haven't been able to do previously. So the movie industry is pretty new in the 1920s, and there's still a lot of silent films. So two of the most famous silent film actors of the time is a guy named Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino. And so the 1920s kind of straddles the era of going from silent films into what they call talkies at the time, which is talking films like we have now. And so at the end of the 1920s, you're going to start to see the first talkies. And so you'll see like cartoons, like Mickey Mouse makes his appearance for the very first time in the 1920s, and some other very famous movie stars and cartoon characters start to come out in the 1920s. And the movie industry is just going to kind of take off from here. And so they love to go to the movies. It was like a huge excursion. People in the cities to go out to the movies once a week was like a really big deal. Now, it also becomes, because of this mass entertainment, you start to see a lot of heroes from the 1920s. And kind of like this, almost like hero worship in a way, as far as these people who are put up on these pedestals on the national scale, other than presidents or famous politicians. And you really hadn't seen this in a big way prior to the 1920s. So one of the most famous ones is going to be a guy named Charles Lindbergh. And he's going to fly this plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. And he really is the first person to do a transatlantic flight, to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. He flies from New York City to Paris. He's the first guy to kind of go across the Atlantic Ocean. And so this was a huge, huge deal. And when he comes back home, he's going to have a huge ticker tape parade, and he is an absolute famous person at the time. And so you have people like Lindbergh who kind of get put onto this national pedestal during the 1920s, and a lot of this has to do with the entertainment culture of the era. So probably the most famous of all famous athletes of any era is going to be Babe Ruth, who comes out of the 1920s. The most famous baseball player ever, and probably the greatest baseball player ever, in my opinion, definitely the greatest baseball player ever. And he's going to kind of shatter records, and he's kind of a great epitome of the 1920s because he is kind of this larger-than-life, living life to the fullest, kind of enjoying life, and rejecting a lot of the old morality of previous generations of Americans. And, people love him. He is famous the world over, not just the United States, across overseas. Everybody kind of knows Babe Ruth and who he was, not just for his athletic exploits, but because of the character that he had, this larger-than-life character. Some other famous people of the era, boxing was pretty huge, and you have this guy named Jack Dempsey, who was definitely the most famous boxer of the era, and he's going to dominate as far as boxing is concerned. Now, all of the 1920s is going to be kind of encompassed by really a new sense of morality. And in a lot of ways, it's a rejection of old American traditional values as far as saving, traditional Christian values as far as what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. If you look at these women here, these women would be what you would call flappers. And so, they're going to dress with shorter skirts or the short bob haircut, and a lot of this stuff is kind of a rejection of old ways of doing things in American society. And so you start to see this in the 1920s, and really, to me, you start to see the first generation gap in American history, where the 1920 generation, the people who are young, you see this a lot in the younger people, like teenagers in the 20s. You start to see people who are looking at the world in a very different way than their parents. And so I don't want you guys to get the wrong idea, because it is definitely not the majority of people who are doing this stuff. But you do have a small selection of people who are kind of living life in a very different way. And all this stuff is connected to previous things that we've talked about. The economy that's doing better, or in a sense doing better in a lot of ways, and there's more money available. And so it's kind of leading into this different lifestyle for some people, kind of living a nightlife and having a good time, which is a very different lifestyle than definitely than their parents had lived, especially if they came from the country. And so you have a very different, perspective on life. Now, again, I just want to kind of reiterate that this is not a majority of people. Most Americans are still kind of clinging to their old traditional values, but you do start to see this undercurrent here, and it's going to kind of grow in American history as time goes on. Now, it's going to lead some authors and some people to kind of be reactionary against this. And the most famous one, you have kind of this term called the lost generation that kind of gets thrown out there in the 1920s to describe this generation, because they feel like their values are kind of lost in a way, and they're kind of losing their way. And so the famous work about this is going to be The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So many of you probably have read this in English. It's a very famous book, and if you haven't read it previously, you probably will read it in English, or you definitely should read it, because this book kind of characterizes the lifestyle of the 1920s, and it's about this guy who lives up in the North Shore on Long Island. He throws these great extravagant parties, and it kind of shows you all of the decadence and the over-the-top mentality that is associated with the 1920s in a lot of ways. And so what you want to understand here about the culture is that the culture is changing, and there's a lot of things going on as far as why the culture is changing, as far as the consumer ideology, advertisement, entertainment, a new outlook on life, kind of a here and now emphasis in certain ways. And Mr. Dunphy is going to kind of get into this more in his screencast, the one that's going to follow, really about how traditional Americans kind of have a backlash against some of the things that they see going on in the 1920s, and they really don't like it in a lot of ways. And so that's where we're going to kind of leave off for today. So hopefully you guys, you enjoy your weekend, and look forward to seeing you guys back in school on Wednesday.